Hi, I'm Mark Lassoff from Framework Television, and I've got another great JavaScript project for you. If you're enjoying these projects, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Today, we've got a tip calculator. This is a fairly simple JavaScript project that's perfect for beginners who are just getting started with the language. Let's take a look. So in order to actually run the project, I'm going to run a simple server called the Simple HTTP Server. And actually, that should be Python. Let me move back here. It should be Python-M, Simple HTTP Server. And then we've got to provide the port that we're using. And we're going to use 8000. You'll notice that the server gets started here. And now that the server is started, we can actually run our website through localhost. And there you can see the tip calculator. I can select a bill amount here by typing it in. Let's say our bill is $51.85. Select a tip amount between 0 and 50%. Let's say we want to give a 20% tip. Then click Calculate Tip, and it gives us the tip amount, which is $10.37, and the total bill of $62.22. So again, a fairly simple project, but we actually did some things in here that professional JavaScript application developers do. So let's start taking a look at the code. Our code actually is divided into a couple of different sections, or files. We have our HTML code in index.html, and we have our JavaScript code in tip.js. So we've separated these two to a degree. And in our index.html, our HTML, of course, provides our look for the application. We've integrated some CSS code in here, some style sheet code, like right there. And the JavaScript provides the processing layer. So we're going to go over the HTML first. Now, what I should note here is for styling and for these components, which look different than the standard HTML components, I used a library called Onsen UI. That's a free library that contains a number of components that are mobile optimized for use in HTML. I really do like this library as the components look pretty cool. We can click on the components menu, and you can see all the different components that are available to you. And these are designed to look a lot like the components in your standard mobile UI for iOS or Android. And you can also go through here and see all the different categories. So for example, we're going to be using the range slider. And if we clicked on the range slider here and go to the web components, it actually has a tutorial on how to use it, and it provides the code. So pretty easy to use even if you're just getting started. That's Onsen UI at onsen.io.com. Almost everybody now, when they start a project, starts with some frameworks. The frameworks are designed to do the heavy lifting to make it easier to develop your app. So by using Onsen, I'm not having to code these components from scratch or figure out the look and feel that I want in CSS. I'm simply using what's provided by Onsen UI and integrating that into my application. So here we've got our code. We start on line 1 with our doc type declaration. This line simply declares that this is going to be an HTML document. And then we start the HTML on line 2, declaring the language right here, English. And then we have our head section. We have a meta tag indicating we're using the UTF-8 character set. And the title of our document is Tip Calculator. These 3 lines right here, I copied from the Onsen website and pasted directly into my document. And if you look, these are links to different components that are part of Onsen. The first link tag on line 6 is the style sheet. And this is the onSend style sheet, and you can see the URL here. There's a second onSend style sheet just for the components, and then there's the JavaScript that drives the whole thing. Now you'll notice these are fully qualified domain names that we're linking to. And what that means is this app only works if we are connected to the network and the internet. If we don't have a connection, it's not going to be able to find the onSend libraries, and therefore the app is not going to work correctly. Something to keep in mind. Now, it's also possible to download all of the onSend libraries and distribute them as part of the app. And that's probably what I would do in production. But for this educational exercise, it's okay just to use the content delivery network and use these URLs. I'd encourage you to do the same thing while you're learning. All right, so that takes care of the head. Head basically our meta tag, our title, and then the links that we need to download the onSend library. Now we get into the body, and you're going to see some tags here that you haven't seen before, like ONS page and ONS toolbar. What onSend does is it has its own unique set of tags that call the onSend components that are already styled for us. So it's an extension to the standard HTML that you already know or are learning. So ONS-toolbar, or excuse me, let's start with this one. ONS-page means we're using an ONS page component. And that simply wraps all of the content on this page. This is a single page app, so our ONS page starts on line 12 and wraps on line 30. And all of the components in between here are part of this page. onSend has a nice page management system, but since we're only doing a single page app, we don't need to use it. Now we come to another onSend component, and of course you're starting to see that all of the onSend components start with ONS-, and this is the onSend toolbar. Here on line 14, you can see we've put in here our framework tip calculator text and centered it. So there you can see it right here. That's the toolbar that's created by using the ONS toolbar tag. I've divided our content into two sections. First is the form section, and then is the results section. The results section is what's displaying our tip amount right here. So inside the form section, which we've set to a padding of 8 pixels, which is giving us this little bit of a margin between the side of our app and the content. You always want to make sure you have a little bit of space, otherwise it looks like things are falling off the edge. All right, so the components that we've drawn are our form field to type the bill amount, our slider to indicate the tip amount, and our calculate button. And of course, you've noticed these don't look like the standard vanilla UI components that are available through HTML. We've modified them with onSend. So here we are in the first section. I've created a logical division to hold our text input, this one right here where it says 2125, and gave it a little space at the bottom of 20 pixels by integrating a CSS style, margin bottom 20 pixels. Normally, I would have an external CSS style sheet, but this app is so short I didn't feel like it was warranted. And this way we can see the styles and the HTML all in one place. But again, the best practice for production and maintenance of your application would be to externalize your CSS, as I do in other apps. Then we have our input tag on line 18. And it's this input tag that is creating the field where we type the amount of the bill. So first of all, the classes here are text input and text input material. So that's giving us the class for this. The placeholder, and there's a class for styling it through onSend, says bill amount. And that placeholder appears right here by default. Right? Bill amount is right there. And then we have the type of UI component this is. This is a text input. and a little style I added with 100% to make it go all the way across the screen. It's a required part of the form, which isn't really doing anything here. And I've given it the ID of bill amount. That'll be important later, because the ID is what we'll use in the JavaScript to grab the content that the user types in here, right? That 4825 will be accessible through this bill amount ID. All right, so there's our input. And then we have a div. Now, by the way, there's also a component in onSend that I could have used for the input. I could have done an onSend input component here as well. All right, and now we have our second div that's got our range slider in it right here. Now, this is another input type, except this time I use the ONS range tag, which provides the slider. I set a width of 75%. You'll see why in a moment. An initial value of 18. I thought 18% is about an average tip, so I figured that's a good default place to put the slider. A minimum value of 0, so you can tip 0, although I don't know why you'd need a calculator for that. You can tip up to 50%, that's our max. And we're going to slide by 0.5. So as someone goes through the slider, they actually can move it 0.5%. In case you want to be really accurate and leave, for example, 18.5%. We also gave this an ID, so it's accessible through the JavaScript, called tip range. Okay, so that's our range slider. Then we have this little guy here called output. And that's this value right here. You'll notice as I slide, it immediately updates the value. That's not a built-in part of the range slider. That's something I added to make it clear to the user exactly what percentage tip they wanted to leave. So that value is contained here in the output. Its ID for JavaScript accessibility is %out. The initial value is 18%. We wanted what the user sees here, 18%, to line up with where we initially have the value of the slider here at 18, right? So the slider itself is set right here. The initial output is set here, and as soon as we slide, that value adjusts. So that's contained here in the output %out. Then we have a final div here with our ONS button control. That's this guy. The modifier large, this is from the ONS library. And the modifier attribute lets us modify an element. Large gives us this big fat button that goes all the way across the screen. I really like using big fat buttons for mobile applications. If you have fat fingers like I do, you probably appreciate that as well. We've ID'd this as BTN Calculate, so our button is accessible through JavaScript. And then we have the words Calculate Tip written on the button. We close off the form section. We have our second section, which has got the output and the result. That's initially empty, but as soon as we do a calculation, and we click the Calculate Tip button, you can see that the result field, right here on line 28, is populated with the results, a tip amount and a total bill. So that's our HTML. You'll notice after we go outside the ONS page, but before we close the body in our basic document structure, we have our connection to the tip script. That's tip.js. So let's move to that right now. And it might even be easier if we split the screen here. So I'm going to put this on top and then our HTML on the bottom. This way, if we need to refer back to the HTML, we can easily do so. Although we're mainly looking at the JavaScript here. Okay, so this runs as soon as all of the HTML components are loaded. We load tip.js and we run it. So what we're doing in this first section, in lines 1 through 5, is we're making connections between the JavaScript and the HTML. The HTML and the JavaScript don't know anything about each other. Any component from the HTML that we're going to utilize in our JavaScript, we've got to bring in and assign to a JavaScript variable or identifier. So that's what we're going to do first. So first here, this is the range slider. So since the value is not going to change, we made it a constant. We called it range, and we assigned it document, get element by ID, tip range. Get element by ID. It does exactly what it sounds like. It gets an element by its ID. So we get the element by ID tip range, which is right here. That's our slider. So we're getting that element, and we're assigning it to the JavaScript identifier range. And we do that for all 5 of these components. So tip out is assigned document get element by ID %out. That's our output field right here on line 23. Right, this guy right here where it says 25.5. In the JavaScript, we're going to call that tip out. Next one's easy. Document get element by ID btn, short for button, calculate, is going to be also called btn calculate in the JavaScript. So when we refer to this big fat button in the JavaScript, it's btn calculate. Then we've got document get element by ID bill amount. That's this input field up here, where it right now says 2255, and I'm changing that value. That's bill amount. And then the result area is where we have the result. So those are all of the components we'll be using in the JavaScript to make the tip calculator work. You'll often hear people say JavaScript is an event-driven language. And what that means is things that occur in the user interface often drive what code runs. So the next bit of code is an example of that. We've got to figure out how do we make this thing calculate. And it calculates when the big button is clicked. So when the big button is clicked, we have code that responds to that. And here you can see that code is on line 11. btn onClick equals function. So this function that starts on line 12 and ends on line 16 runs in response to a button click. So anytime I click the button, like that, what's happening is this function is called button calculate onClick, and lines 12 through 16 of code are run. Now there's another event here that you probably haven't thought about, but as this slider is dragged back and forth, the value in this output is changing. So remember that the slider is called range. We defined that in line 1 of tips.js. Range, and the event is on drag. So when it's dragged, this function will run. And this function is pretty simple. It's going to change tip outs, inner HTML, right? This guy is tip out, to the value of the range slider between 0 and 50 and add a percentage sign. So right now we're running line 8 over and over again, replacing the tip out, right, the output right here, with the value of the range slider and adding a percent sign. So we've run, just by sliding back and forth, we run line 8 100 times. It's pretty responsive. This is fast enough to keep up with it. So now when the button's clicked, right, and when the button's clicked, when the real work is going to occur, that's when we're actually going to calculate the tip. Here we go. So button click, onClick equals function, right? So this is the function that's going to run when the button's clicked. So now the bill amount is the bill amount dot value. So the bill is the variable. We're assigning at billamount.value. That's the value that's up here, 104.45. 104.45 is billamount.value. We're going to make sure that's a floating point number. So we've surrounded that with the parse float method. That's going to parse that down to a floating point value, making sure it's input that way. The reason for that is whenever we enter a value here, it's read into the JavaScript as a string. We've got to say to JavaScript, hey, we want this to be a number, so parse that string as a float. Essentially, we're removing the quote signs around it so it can be used in part of a calculation. So that's assigned in the bill. This as a number, 54.55, is stored in the bill. We then calculate the tip. The tip is the bill that we just got times our value here in the range divided by 100, right? A 28% tip is actually a 0.28 tip. So we're converting it to decimal by dividing by 100. And then we're getting 2 decimal places by attaching that to the toFixed2 method right here, which essentially says I want 2 decimal places so this looks like currency. So let's look at the calculation again. We've got the value here. This is the bill. We're going to multiply the bill times the value of our range here, divided by 100, so it's a decimal, and we're going to set that to 2 decimal places. So that's our tip amount. The total, we're simply going to add the tip amount to the bill, making sure, again, the tip is a floating point number and displayed like currency with toFixed2. So we now have stored in tip the tip value, right, we just calculated, and stored in total the total bill after you add the tip. And now we're going to create our output in a variable called out. So I'm using ES6 string interpolation. If you're not familiar, ES6 is the current version of JavaScript. It's added some heavy-duty methods to strings, including the string interpolation that I'm about to show you. It makes creating long strings much easier. So here our output is going to be strong, so that's bold, tip amount, strong, and then the tip. So this $sign that you see in the tip amount is created right here. This $sign and the French brackets, this gets the value of the variable tip and inserts it right there. So that's what's inserting 17.18, right? Because that's what's stored in the variable tip at this point. And then we break. So remember, this $sign is to display the actual $sign label. The second one is to do the string interpolation along with the curly brackets. That's what gets the value of the variable tip. We break. Again, we surround the label total bill with strong tags in order for that to be bold. We display a $sign label, and then we use string interpolation to get the value of the variable total that we calculated on line 14. So this is creating this output right here, inserting whatever values the variables hold. Then you'll remember result area is this output right here, which we got in line 5, right? We made that area result area in JavaScript, and we're simply going to take this out variable that we created and put that out variable right there. And that's what gives us the tip. One more time. There we go. Works great. So that's a basic tip calculator in JavaScript. I challenge you to add some of your own features to this. Why don't you add a tax component or change the display so it's more attractive? This code is yours to work with. You're more than welcome to modify it and learn from it. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Lassoff from Framework Television. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.